So thanks everybody for joining. My name is Eitan Basri. I'm a member at SPH. So today we're going to share some of the lessons that we've learned from the Wexner Heritage Program Leadership Development Program. We're halfway through the 2-year program. And I thought it would be nice, now that we've completed quite a bit of learning, to share with the rest of the Kahal, like, what is it that we're doing? We have these sessions that maybe you've heard about, the application process. Turns out we have 4 people from the synagogue who are participating, which is actually a pretty high ratio. There's only 20 participants in Seattle who are participating in this program at this time. So we'll go through some of the different details of what we've been learning and also kind of what we think this learning means for the future. Before we do that, I wanted to make sure we take a chance for introductions, because not everybody necessarily knows everyone, so we'll have the panelists introduce themselves. So Miri, can I ask you to kick off?
Sure, of course. Thanks, Eitan. My name is Miri Azos Tilson, and I am a proud 3rd generation, actually 4th generation member of SBH and Seattleite. I am really just honored to be considered for this program. It's something that I always thought of, that it was very prestigious to be a Wexner Fellow, growing up having seen different members of our community, the Almos, Eli and Rebecca, and Jack and Tamar Ben-Zikri, just really the people that have made a tremendous impact on our community and have been generational members, to be part of this program and to be given leadership tools and training in our adult life, rather than just growing up as kids with our Jewish education. So I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate you joining us today.
Ben?
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Littman, and I've been living here with my wife, Leah Almo Littman, for almost 6 years. We moved from Los Angeles, and certainly SBH has been home for many years. And we moved about 6 years ago, so we have 2 girls, and you know, just love the community and the warmth of SBH, and really just happy to be a part of this tonight. And really Wexner, it's a great leadership program that we've embarked on. And I'm fortunate to be with just a great cohort and just a few of my colleagues that are on tonight. So glad to be here.
Thanks, Ben. Jonathan?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan. I'm a transplant from New York, but at this point, that was, as it turns out, more than half a lifetime ago. So I think it sort of counts that I'm a Seattle native-ish at this point. Certainly know a lot of folks in the community through school. I've got 3 kids that go to SHA. That's how I sort of came in contact with Maura Rubisa as well. My understanding is her husband is actually involved in the shul as well, which I think is lovely. And I am sort of just beyond thrilled to be in a cohort with just these 19 amazing people, that it's just wonderful to chat with them, to learn from them, to learn with them, kind of on essentially a bi-weekly basis. And so to me, this has just been a really fantastic experience.
Hey everybody, my name is Eitan Basri. I've been a SBH member since I think 2007. My claim to fame is I married Sonia Jason, who is a native of this community. And and I'm on the board at SBH now. So let's go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to share my passions for this program, and I really want to get into it. So before we get into the specifics of the institute that we just finished this summer, I want to turn over to Miri to kind of give you a background of what this program is, why it exists, and what people get out of it. Miri, can you kind of walk us through that?
Absolutely. So Leslie Wexner, who is a Jewish American billionaire, he was asked to lead his Jewish Federation nearly 30 years ago. And while he felt that he had the tools to obviously build a business and lead a company, he felt that he didn't really know much about Jewish leadership and how to affect change. So he decided to establish the Leslie and Abigail Wexner Foundation, the Wexner Foundation. And basically there are several different programs, but the one that we are part of, fortunate to be part of, is specifically focused on lay leaders and people that are professionals and volunteers within their communities, helping them develop their leadership skills over a 2-year period. And the accomplishments of I think there's over 2,000 graduates of the program are wide ranging. We had to be nominated for this program by somebody who was already a Wexner fellow and graduate. And then we were chosen as 20 to be the Seattle 19 cohort. So we just completed our first year. We had our second institute this summer, and it's the second of 3. So we began last summer, and we have a curriculum that began with biblical studies, and we'll be learning about transformative leadership. And then we'll be ending our 2-year program with a trip to Israel, where we will hopefully actually get to go next summer, fingers crossed. And then we'll just go on to really work within the organizations of our community here in the Seattle area, and hopefully affect some change and put our skills to work. So right now, we were recognized for the work that we've already done, but one of the changes that they just told us they'll be making for the next year is we'll already begin working with organizations in order to help begin affecting change and looking forward to shaping our future, and hopefully in a very positive way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, like Miri was saying, the program is typically 2 years, and it's got a kind of a proven structure to it. Year 1 being really focused on Jewish topics, Jewish history, Torah. Second year being really focused more on leadership skills and practices. The global pandemic has actually created a bigger sense of urgency for us all as emerging leaders to be more involved, to be more boots on the ground involved with various projects in town because of the need. So like Miri was saying, we just completed a virtual institute last month. It was a 3-day institute, pretty full days in my opinion. I think my colleagues would agree about that. And there were different tracks. Some of the, like any conference, there were some sessions that were, plenary where everybody has to go, and there were some that were elective where you select a track. So I thought it would be nice if we could have, since it's all fresh in our mind, we could have people take turns from the cohort here to share what they learned and kind of what the relevance was of it for them. And so I'd like to start with Miri to kind of walk us through what your elective was and the value you got out of it.
Thanks, Eitan. So the core elective that I attended, which was for, we had a 3-day institute, was given by Shuki Taylor, and it was titled Values in Action, How Jewish Values Can Ground, Guide, and Grow Our Leadership. This was a very interesting class and had many different components to it, so I'm going to try to squeeze as much as I can into this presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen here, just a moment. Okay. Did that work? No. Okay. Here we go. So we started by talking about values and what is a value. And we were asked to choose a value that resonated with us. And it was anything ranging from peace to justice to kindness, tzedakah, and I chose gratitude. So we were asked to share our value and why we chose it. And although many of these values resonated with us, and me personally, I chose gratitude because it's something that I strive to frame my daily life with. And as we discussed each of our values and why we chose it, Shuki explained the difference between what he called a thin idea and a thick expression. So a thin idea of a value is a very general explanation. So it's something that encapsulates a general idea, and it's very broad. So when I say, oh, I resonated with, or gratitude is the value that I chose and resonated with me, you can think of it very, very broadly, especially today when there's so much of a focus on an attitude of gratitude. People have gratitude journals, and it's something that a lot of people are practicing. But he explained the difference of a thin idea versus a thick expression. And so to take gratitude, for example, you can generally speak about gratitude, but when I explain more specifically what it means to me personally and how it impacts my life, or just an example of a moment where I had gratitude or how I express gratitude, that definition can be in conflict with someone else's idea of gratitude. And that specific expression is what he described as a thick expression of a value. So it's something very specific. And in the context of value-driven leadership, we discussed the role of conflict and the importance of conflict. So conflict is a tension between a value or two values, and that ignites exploration and leads us to growth. So a common conflict among boards and within organizations, this is not going to come as a surprise, is innovation versus preservation. Shuki gave us an example of a very famous example of Rabbi Shimon's Midrash when God was contemplating the creation of man, and the angels were debating whether or not man should be created. Truth was opposed to kindness, and righteousness or peace was opposed to justice. So we really talked about how can truth and kindness be opposed. You would think that especially within yourself, those two values can work in sync. But the truth is, pun intended, that the truth hurts. The truth can hurt. The truth can be very painful. And when being kind, you may not be able to embody that full value of truth. So he gave us some archetypal conflicts that I thought were interesting and relevant. I mentioned innovation versus preservation, and I think this is especially relevant to a longstanding institution such as a 100-plus-year-old synagogue, where we want to innovate and create something new, but we also want to preserve what we have. And how do we find a balance between the two when one is in conflict with the other? So he discussed this law of creative limitation, which I thought was really fascinating, and it was one of my favorite quotes. Talent is like a muscle. Without something to push against it, it atrophies. So we deliberately put obstacles in our path, barriers that will inspire us. And that to me just really resonated, because we need to have those who are focused on preservation and those who are focused on innovation coming together in order to move forward and create something new. So that's just one example, but individual versus collective, that's self-explanatory when you're thinking of your own needs or thinking of the needs of the broader group. How do you balance those two? Obligation and autonomy, safety versus risk. And then he gave some more of these values: loving kindness and truth, as I mentioned before, dependence and independence, agreement and challenge, and justice and peace. So neither should be the only value, but we should have constant conflict between those two values, and that when we're working on a board or within an organization, it's important to have those values represented and for the thick expressions to also be represented. Because as a general idea, we may agree on something, but when it comes down to the details of how we really express those values, it's important that we come to some kind of balanced conclusion and that we move forward together. he also shared with us this graph. It's actually, I took a picture with my phone, so sorry for the graphics, but it's basically different cycles that any organization or even people go through. So a diffuser is somebody that has no choice and no commitment. Moratorium is you do have a choice, but you are lacking commitment. Foreclosure is not having a choice, but feeling committed. And achievement is choice, having the choice and being committed. And that's ultimately where we want to be. So most of the world is in a moratorium, right? Where we have tons of choices and people are not fully committed to an organization. So for me, I feel very committed to SBH, and I do have a choice, but it's not as strong as my commitment. And ultimately, this cycle goes on and on, because once you achieve the achievement status, and then there will be some type of complacency that will set in, and then it will just go back around to diffusers. You want people to be so committed and, choosing to be part of something, and then it will just become second nature. They won't give it as much thought, and then it will revert back to diffusers. So it's something that we should constantly have in mind and that we want to work towards. Is there any question about what I mentioned, or is that clear?
Yeah, and folks can, if you need to, you can post questions in the chat. That's also an option if you don't feel like voicing. Yeah. No, that was great, Mary. Thank you for providing that. Really interesting stuff. I get the sense also that quadrants are very popular, because I also had quadrants in my elective. So that's definitely a thing. Hey, Ben, I'd love to hear a little bit about your session, if you can share that.
Sure. So I actually went a little bit out of my own comfort zone, and I went to a session known as essentially being an advocate in the now. And it was taught by an artistic director named Aaron Henney. And Aaron is in Los Angeles, and he's actually with something known as the Dybbuk Theater, where they put on different productions of different types of issues and ethical issues and concerns from the Torah, and they actually make this into a production. So it really was about, developing your pitch, developing your story, and how we're effective in our communication skills. So essentially, showing a certain vulnerability to our audience and really telling our story, that personal story that we have, and how that story might connect us to something that is important that we want to achieve. And it could be something as simple as, I want to tell you why I want to have blueberry yogurt in the morning. Or it could be something as I want to start a teen mignon at SBH, for example, or restart a teen mignon, for example. So it could be a lot of different things based on those human experiences, those early stories about one's identity and what provides passion for them. And Aaron went on to talk about how we have our own narrative. And he mentioned a teacher historian, Ellen Feig, and how she had come up with this idea about how we tell our stories as Jews. And one of those stories is the exile narrative, the story, of course, of from Exodus, when we leave Egypt, and Paro's, going on we're essentially leaving. The sea is breaking. There's bread that's unleavened, and we tell the story all over the world, essentially every springtime. So there was that story. And then we went on to talk about the wilderness narrative. And that's essentially the story, is that we're we're journeying on throughout the desert, and we're transforming. And we focus on who we're becoming as we're developing. And then finally we talked a bit about the redemptive story, and we're kind of, seems like we're going to be getting the land, and it's this time of year as we're in Devarim, and we're talking about getting ready to enter the land, and we're of course we're accepting the 10 Commandments and everything else. So we've got all these different stories, and we were really tasked to talk about what are those different stories. Each one of us has an exile story, a wilderness story, and a redemptive story that we can share about our lives. And that was really what he was asking us to do. He was asking us to be vulnerable in the moment. He had mentioned, for some of you that follow Brene Brown, she's a researcher, and she writes a lot of different articles and has podcasts. And we're talking about how we can be vulnerable and how we can share that story that's unique to us as we try to, in some ways, be persuasive or show people why we have a right to be at that table. So that was one of the things that we had talked about. Another thing that was interesting was we would then get into role playing. We would be set up with what he referred to as something called task. We would have the first one, which is the T, would be for talk. So I would explain a particular situation. I would have a partner that would talk about their particular community. And just to backtrack a second, when we were doing this role playing, we were working with different cohorts in Cincinnati, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, San Francisco, and Atlanta. So I was interacting with different partners that were in different communities and understanding some of the issues and concerns that were coming up in that particular community. So we used this different approach, the talk, to talk out, to listen, and to then essentially ask questions as the A, to essentially ask clarifying questions, to really get curious, to understand everything that the person had talked about. And then at that point, we would then share. Once we had confirmed everything that we had heard, then that was the opportunity for us to then share our thoughts. We had to make sure that we really had very strong listening skills to what was being presented. And then finally, what did you hear? What were the takeaways? What are the possible next steps? That was the K for the no, that we would then the person would then go to the next step. So that was kind of how we would create this challenge, this opportunity in this story. And we would discuss it in a variety of different ways. Everything from discussing again what the need is, what the possibility is, qualifying that example, then creating a solution, and then opening it up to an invitation. And this was really interesting because in that invitation, you're collaborating as you're trying to pitch or develop whatever that message may be. That message may be stronger unity within the Jewish community. That could be wanting another Chinese dairy restaurant in Seattle. So it could be a lot of different examples. But that was essentially what my session was, and while we all had different sessions we could choose, and there were others as well. And Eitan, I think about that because there were some that we definitely wanted, but this was something that I certainly enjoyed. And, you know, knowing that my wife, Leah, she's the theatrical part of the family, the fact that I sort of went out of my comfort zone and got into sort of storytelling and pitching. And that was sort of my goal and objective going into this Wexner Heritage Program, Madragot.
Nice. Thanks, Ben. You know, it's really interesting you mentioned comfort zone. I think one of the most important things for this program, I know for a lot of us, has been getting out of your comfort zone, trying new things, hearing new perspectives. Again, 4 of us from SBH, we've got 20 people around Seattle, all different backgrounds. Some people growing up with strong Jewish identity, some people growing up with no Jewish identity, and actually Wexner being their first dedicated learning journey that they have, and so hearing all those different perspectives is interesting. And I'm also glad that you brought up the aspect of all the different cohorts from different cities. One of the benefits, I didn't even realize how great a benefit this was going to be, would be the ability to connect with Jewish leaders from different cities around the country. How are you dealing with this particular challenge? How are you encountering it? Really, really interesting to see that the common challenges and some of the nuances of different communities. If I had to summarize, I would say we have it pretty good in Seattle. So everybody should feel really good about living in Seattle on the whole. Jonathan, if I turn it over to you for a little take on your elective, can you share with us?
Yeah, thanks, Eitan. So actually tying back to what Eitan just said, I actually grew up with a very strong Jewish identity, but a very weak Jewish education. And so I've felt that very acutely as I've kind of gotten older, as my kids have started attending, right, sort of an Orthodox Jewish day school, and as I've gotten much more involved communally, right, in nonprofit Jewish boards, where I feel like I'm sort of standing on this huge, strong foundation, and I have just no idea whatsoever what's in it. And so for me, a huge appeal of the program has been that it in many cases has almost gone back to first principles, right? In other words, like, let's take a look at Tanakh, let's take a look at Talmud, Mishnah, and let's analyze the stories for what the leadership lessons are, right? And so how does Judaism, like, sort of what leadership lessons are we being taught from our kind of keystone documents, if you will? This was a huge focus of the Summer Institute that kicked things off last summer. It was the sort of entire focus of our first 5 sessions, right? That was all about sort of biblical Judaism and leadership lessons that you can pull out of sort of, Moshe and people in the wilderness and everybody complaining, right? And sort of how he dealt with it or how he didn't deal with it, depending on how you want to look at it. And then, of course, excuse me, the huge adaptive change, right? After the temple was destroyed and the switch to rabbinic Judaism. And the effort sort of that was made to tie that back to biblical Judaism, right? To kind of to point a path forward, even though things were different, right? They're also the same, kind of coming back to that tension in values that, like Miri was talking about. And so for me, for Madragot, I was very excited to kind of continue that path. And I picked a core elective called the Leadership Torah of Now. And mine was actually, it was a little funky, as opposed to sort of everybody else who had the same instructor for 3 sessions across all 3 days. And there was kind of one, almost an arc of the class that was being taught. Mine was 3 different instructors on each of the different days. And so it was, each day was almost like a dealer's choice, right? Sort of what that particular instructor felt was relevant as far as leadership and Judaism and Torah and tying it to the contemporary. And so we got 3 very different slices, I'll say, of leadership lessons. The first day was taught by a woman, some of you I'm sure know, her name is Arna Pupko-Fisher. And she was actually our biblical teacher for those first 5 sessions. And she really focused in deeply on that great leadership involves doubt, right? In other words, assuming you don't have all the answers and you're more interested in getting it right than being right, which, sort of anybody who's been involved with, well, anything in the Jewish community and especially a Jewish board, right? You sort of know how important that is. And she tied that back to a lot of the stories about Rabbi Akiva, right? This is actually sort of doubt and willingness to accept that he might not have all the answers, and the answers he thinks he has might not be the right answers, is actually listed a number of times as being one of the defining characteristics of Rabbi Akiva, right? So it's a very Judaic trait, and it's super important as far as effective leadership is concerned. On the second day was Rabbi Uri Topolovsky, and he's based out of Maryland and formerly New Orleans. And he focused in on two different things. The first one was kind of the concept of windows in our walls. And he kind of pointed at there's a midrash, right, that says that as the Israelites were kind of walking through the parted sea, right, during the Exodus, there were actually 12 separate paths through the sea, one for each tribe. However, there were windows between the paths through the water so that everybody could see and speak to each other, right? And the idea there is that we all walk our own paths, but ultimately we're one people, right? And the concept is even so important that if you kind of look at Jewish law, the rabbis codified it, right? Shulchan Aruch states that we're actually supposed to put windows in the walls of the sanctuary, and ideally it should be 12 in there, right? One for each tribe. And so kind of tying that back to sort of this midrash and the Jewish tradition, the one that I thought was even more poignant from my perspective was kind of what he called creating a culture of change, right? Which, I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard that. It's a big buzzword. But he basically pointed out that if you look at Shemot, specifically Shemot 40, verses 17 through 38, it tells us, right, it tells the whole story of how on any given day, the tabernacle could move, right? And the Israelites, they had no clue if it was coming or not. It all depended on whether or not the pillar of smoke was there or wasn't there, right? It was decision completely made by Hashem. The Israelites had to give up all control and had to be ready to pick everything up and move at a moment's notice. And so the question that you could sort of raise from there, right? If this is our core tradition, right? This is Jews in the wilderness with the presence of Hashem directly in our midst, right? What if all of our institutions today were flexible enough to move at any time, right? Just like the Mishkan, right? And it kind of gets you thinking, right? About are our institutions kind of flexible, or are they maybe a little more ossified than we would like? And sort of, are we as nimble as we really would like to be, and as we probably need to be? I mean, as the sort of world around us right now is kind of highlighting. The third day was very interesting, I thought, from an intellectual standpoint, a little less tied to leadership. It really dug into, it was one of the rabbis who is on the sort of central council of the conservative movement. And he's the one who had written the official conservative movement responsa to whether or not or how you could do triage, literal sort of medical triage, if there are limited resources, right? And so this was written in the early days of COVID, and if there was a limited number of respirators and there's somebody already on a respirator and somebody who is more important or more likely to recover, or somebody you like better, right, happens to walk into the hospital and is in need of that respirator, when, if ever, is it okay to kind of pull that respirator out, right, from the person who maybe doesn't need it as much or doesn't deserve it as much, and give it to that person? And it was very interesting. It goes back to ultimately Shmuel Bet, right? There's this sort of one small little story in there about Sheba ben Bichri. And so basically, right, he had sort of rebelled against David right after he was appointed king. And the followers of David came to the town that he had sort of gone in to seek sanctuary. And they basically told the people of the town, hey, look, we can either, kind of kill you all. We have a siege going on here. Or you could just sort of kill him, and then all the rest of you are fine, right? Because he's the one who's been saying terrible things about David. And then the community ultimately chopped off his head and threw it over the wall, and then everybody was happy except for Sheba ben Bichri, one assumes. And that one sort of raises the question of, well, when is it ever? And there's obviously been a lot of rabbinical commentary over the ages. When is it okay to say, hey, yeah, we'll sacrifice one life, especially one Jewish life, for the greater good, right? And it was just a very kind of interesting deep dive on that. A lot of it was in response to two doctors that had put together a very utilitarian ranking order of who deserved respirators first, second, third, and all the way down to the bottom of the list. And the ultimate conclusion, right, just to sort of give away the ending, was that as far as Judaism is concerned, right, every life is equally sacred, and the only time it is ever okay, right, to sort of pull a respirator from one person and hand it to another is if that person who was on the respirator was already known and agreed by the doctors to be terminally ill and was not going to live longer than a year, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff, sort of writings over the ages that codify that 1 year as well. And Sheba ben Bichri, right, a lot of the sort of interpretations over the years have basically said the only reason it was even okay to sacrifice him back then was because, you know, the city had actually had a vote and he had been condemned to death regardless. And so I thought that one was very interesting, you know, kind of looking at the lesson of everybody's life, everybody's sort of contribution, if you will, being equally sacred, I thought was fascinating. It didn't tie into leadership quite as much as the other two, at least not as directly. And so, yeah, I mean, that was Madrigot for me. I came away from it very, very pleased, right? Again, continuing to fill in what I feel are the gaps as far as my Jewish development and my Jewish journey is concerned. So,
cool.
Thanks,
Jonathan. Yeah, so I'll share my my experience. I have a couple slides that our facilitator shared that I'll just run through just as a sample to kind of give you a taste of what it is. Hopefully, it came through on the screen for all of you. So Lisa K. Solomon is a designer in residence at the Stanford School of Design. For those who aren't aware of the Stanford School of Design, it's an incredible institute. You can go online, you can read about it. It's a very modern way of approaching design. And when we say design, we don't just, for those who aren't familiar with how what's included in design schools, we're not talking about like fashion design. We're not talking about necessarily, could be software design, but it's not just like tech and it's not just clothing. It's like everything. Like when you go through something like this and you see the role that design plays in just programs, like not even products, it's really incredible and it's really inspirational. This particular session was a little bit light on Jewish content. I'll go through some of the ideas. I think the ideas are more important than than the Jewish topics that we actually covered. So the idea was how to lead as a futurist. The idea of a leader, one of the responsibilities of a leader is to be a good planner and to be a good steward of an organization. And so there's kind of three key things that she talked about. When you have to think as a futurist, you have to do what's called scenario planning. Some of you may have heard of that before. The basic idea is you take a long view. You're looking at the long term for the organization. You want to be able to consider the context not only of what's happening inside the organization, but what's happening around it. So if we're thinking about SPH, we're not only thinking about the synagogue, we're thinking about the greater Jewish community, and we're also thinking about the greater city of Seattle, and we're thinking about the broader Jewish community outside of maybe even Seattle in the United States. And then you bring in multiple perspectives. There's all kinds of ways that might be valuable, but one of them for bringing in multiple perspectives is to be thorough and to make sure that you don't miss anything when you plan for different scenarios, right? So having people who are existing members, having people who are new members, having people who are prospective members, all these different sorts of perspectives really matter. There's an example that Lisa shared with Shell. So Shell typically would do planning in a very linear way, right? They would take their present situation, they would forecast out based off of the past, and that was the plan. And what they realized they had to do, I forget the reasons why, but there were some unexpected things that had happened with them. They decided that they would actually create scenarios with multiple potential paths. So if for the price of oil changed, for example, like that would create a different scenario. If they were able to make certain breakthroughs, maybe in, I don't know, alternative energy, then they would do other things and all sorts of complicated things. I mean, it's a big company, so I can't do it justice. But the idea was that they would have different scenarios based off of different events happening, different contingencies happening over time. The obvious scenario that we're all trying to plan for is, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. And there are different scenarios there regarding the duration of the pandemic, how long it's going to be based off of vaccines and things like that. And those could, and of course, the measures that we're all taking, such as social distancing and limiting contact, could be contributing factors to faster recovery or slower recovery. And so we have to think through, like, what are the different paths? And this is the thing that, we at the synagogue are thinking about, in the leadership, all of our schools are thinking about, even a lot of businesses are thinking about, is what are the different options. There's not one plan that's going to be the right plan. There are certain things that will contribute to how we respond based off of the reality on the ground. I thought these were really, really interesting ways, very present ways that we need to be thinking about this. So why do all of this? Why go through all of this scenario planning? There's two real reasons. The first of all, if we can imagine the different paths the future can take, they help us to be better prepared for these longer term contingencies. So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, okay, well, should we hire more employees at SBH to support programs? Should we invest in facilities at SBH to update, the campus? Those are things that seem like a no-brainer, and then we don't know what the future is going to be. So we need to imagine different futures to try to understand how our investments should be played out based on those. The second reason is, with these key indicators and you get more signals of change, you help ensure that the decisions along the way are flexible to plan for and accommodate that change. So, I'll give you a real example. We were thinking about getting a tent when we were having outdoor services. Should we rent a tent or should we buy a tent? Well, if we rent it and contingencies change, then we are not stuck with the tent. If we buy the tent, then we might save some money in the long run, right? These are all the sorts of examples of why scenario planning is so fundamental to really to any endeavor, but even more so with the current reality that our world is dealing with. Thinking about how can we plan for not only plan A and plan B, but plan C, D, E, and F as well. And that's, for me, like what really was relevant from that is, like, we're trying to, at the synagogue, plan for a future. We want to plan for a bright and vibrant future. We also want to be responsible, both in terms of health, our public health, and also in terms of our finances. So those are the things that I'm thinking about right now. And I want to open it up to the rest of the panel to share. I know many of you shared this during your share, but if there's any other things you want to add, Miri, Jonathan, Ben, anything else that you want to add for kind of what you think the program in general has that's relevant for SPH? And if there's any comments from folks on the call, I would love to hear from you, your reactions, questions about the program.
I would just say, going back to the class that I took about values, and again, specifically about preservation versus innovation, that was something that really resonated with me, specifically with regards to SBH and our board and our community, because preservation is really important to me. It's why I'm here in the first place, because I feel the responsibility to preserve our beautiful customs and what makes SBH so special. At the same time, I feel that we have to be innovative. We have to find new ways to connect with people, new ways to grow, and to serve the community. Otherwise, we won't be able to preserve what we have. And that's just, to me, that idea of, the positive effect of conflict was something that really sparked kind of motivation in me, and sharing values with other people. So hearing from other cohorts that people in different cities face the same dilemmas. That was something that also just kind of reinvigorated me in my role on the board and in the community, because there definitely is a kind of burnout from being a volunteer, and considering the limited pool of volunteers that we have, I do feel a responsibility, but I also at times feel burdened. So that was something that definitely made me feel reinvigorated and kind of excited about the dynamic of our board and our situation, and hopeful for the future.
Yeah. I would just jump in and say that, as has been talked about, we've talked a lot about resilience. We've talked a lot about, another area was adaptive leadership. That we had talked a lot about and continue to talk a lot about. So this Madrigot was reshaped as was mentioned, was really reshaped given everything that's going on in the world. And, you know, SBH was founded in 1914. SBH has gone through, you know, at least a couple global pandemics over the years, World War I, World War II, a Korean War, Vietnam, and now we're going through some unprecedented times. And I think that, you know, the early builders of the synagogue, you know, really had some great foresight. And if I'm correct in saying, I think it was just after the Depression or sometime in the 20s where SBH was building, I think in the Central District, if I'm correct, and if I'm wrong, certainly someone please correct me. But you know, that's really during those times taking it on. And I would just sort of conclude by saying, with everything going on in the world today, I think that this creates an opportunity for us to step back, but to move forward and to look at where do we come out of this? Just like previous generations developed new things and new aspects out of sort of global crises that they had to deal with.
Yeah, you brought up a great point, Ben, and I meant to mention that in my session, the concept of adaptive leadership. So Ron Hayfitz, who's at the Harvard Business School, was one of the founders of this concept of adaptive leadership. You can read about it. It's been published on Harvard Business Review and all this. But the Wexner program uses it as its kind of touchstone for its leadership concept. And it's a really simple idea. The idea of adaptive leadership is that at every stage of change, leaders need to recognize the need to be flexible, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to embrace the fact that new circumstances require adaptation. Before we wrap up, any final comments from Jonathan or Miri? I think Ben, I think you really hit it on the head with your last comment. Okay. Well, if there's any questions, I don't see any questions in the chat unless I missed some. So thank you everybody for joining. It was really a pleasure to get to share some of this with you. I think we'd like to keep you informed as we continue through the program. So maybe we'll do this again. And if you have more questions about the program, reach out to one of us. I know we'd all be happy to share